The town of Black Hollow had long forgotten the old Whitaker estate, letting it rot at the end of a winding dirt road, smothered by an army of skeletal trees. But when the Garrett family moved in, desperate for a fresh start, the whispers returned. The house had a history, a dark one. It was once home to the Whitaker twins, Elias and Edwin, identical boys who never spoke a word. Their silence was not by choice. It was something deeper, something imposed. People claimed they could communicate without speech, finishing each other's thoughts, eyes flickering with understanding no one else could grasp. Then one night they vanished. Their mother was found in the attic, a noose biting into her throat, her lifeless eyes frozen in terror. Their father had fled town days before, ranting about the voices in the walls. As for the twins, they were never seen again. The Garretts knew none of this. They were drawn to the estate's low price and sprawling land, ignoring the uneasy stares of the townsfolk. Mark and Julia, along with their 6-year-old daughter, Lily, moved in with cautious excitement. For the first few nights, everything seemed fine. But then, Lily began whispering in her sleep. At first, Julia thought it was normal. Children have nightmares. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Then came the drawings. Pages upon pages of charcoal sketches littered Lily's floor. 2 identical boys with hollow eyes, mouths stretched in silent screams. In every picture, their arms were outstretched, as if reaching for something or someone. One night, Julia woke to a soft thump, thump, thump outside Lily's room. The hallway was empty, but the air was thick, suffocating. The walls seemed to breathe. When she reached for the doorknob, her blood turned to ice. On the wood, carved in jagged letters, were 2 words. "Let us in." And then, from inside Lily's room, 2 voices whispered in unison. Not Lily's. Something else. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting. Julia stood frozen in the hallway, her breath shallow, heart hammering against her ribs. The whispering from inside Lily's room had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that stretched on for far too long. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the doorknob, pushing it open with a slow, agonizing creak. The room was dimly lit by the pale glow of the moon filtering through the window. Lily sat upright in bed, her tiny hands clutching a crumpled piece of paper. Her eyes, wide, unblinking, stared past Julia, fixated on something in the farthest corner of the room. Julia's breath hitched. The corner was darker than it should have been, an unnatural void where the moonlight refused to reach. "Lily?" Her voice cracked. Her daughter didn't react. Julia stepped forward, the floorboards groaning beneath her weight. That's when she noticed the paper in Lily's hands. Without thinking, she plucked it away and unfolded it. Her stomach twisted at what she saw. It was another drawing. This one was different. 2 identical figures stood outside Lily's window, their hollow eyes fixed on her sleeping form. But something was wrong with their mouths, wide open, black voids filled with jagged, gaping holes, as if their voices had been ripped from them. Below them, scrawled in a child's uneven handwriting, were 3 words. "They are here." Julia's blood turned to ice. A tap so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind came from the window. She spun around, her pulse roaring in her ears. Nothing was there, just the swaying trees and the endless blackness beyond. But the unease in her gut told her otherwise. "Lily, who drew this?" Julia demanded, keeping her voice steady. Her daughter turned her head, mechanical and slow, her voice barely a whisper. "They did." Mark woke to the sound of Julia's frantic voice. He found her in the kitchen, pale and shaking, clutching the drawing like it was a death sentence. "Julia, what the hell?" "They're in the house, Mark," she interrupted, her voice a desperate hiss. "Lily's been seeing them, hearing them." Mark rubbed the exhaustion from his face. "You're scaring yourself over nothing. It's an old house. It makes noises. She's a kid. She probably has an overactive imagination." Julia wanted to believe that. She really did. But when she looked at Lily sitting at the breakfast table, quietly drawing again, she felt it. Something was watching them. That night, the house breathed. Mark was the first to hear it. a rhythmic, hollow in and out like the slow inhale of something ancient, something waiting. He sat up in bed, skin prickling with unease. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the walls. And then the knocking started. Soft at first. Tap, tap, tap. Then harder. Thump, thump, thump. It came from everywhere, above, below, behind the walls. Mark jumped out of bed, adrenaline spiking. The house was alive with sound. The air was thick, damp, suffocating. Then the voices came. A hushed chorus of whispers slithered through the air, layered over one another. Unintelligible, yet unmistakably pleading. "Let us in." Mark turned to wake Julia, but she was already awake, clutching the sheets, eyes wide with terror. And then Lily screamed. Julia and Mark raced to their daughter's room. The second they flung the door open, the temperature plummeted. The walls were covered in new drawings, hundreds of them, taped up, scrawled in black charcoal, filling every inch with space. But Lily wasn't in her bed. She was standing in front of the window, staring outside. Mark grabbed her, turning her around. Her lips trembled, and she raised a shaking finger to the glass. "They're coming," she whispered. Outside, in the moonlit backyard, two figures stood motionless. They were identical, pale, thin, their heads tilted slightly to one side, as if studying the house. Their eyes, deep, endless pits, locked onto Julia's. And then, slowly, achingly slow, they lifted their hands and pressed them against the glass from the outside. Lily let out a breath. "They remember." Mark pulled Lily away from the window and slammed the curtains shut, his hands shaking. "We're leaving. Now." But the house had other plans. The moment they reached the front door, the lights flickered and died. The temperature dropped further, their breath now visible in the thickening air. A low, guttural creak groaned from above, like something shifting in the attic. And then, the voice, a whisper, slithering from the walls, from the very bones of the house. "You can't leave." A deafening bang erupted from upstairs, followed by rapid, scuttling footsteps. The ceiling above them trembled. Something was up there. Something was moving. Julia grabbed Lily, and Mark reached for the doorknob, yanking it with all his strength. It wouldn't budge. Then, from behind them, Lily whispered, "They're inside now." The sound of footsteps pounded from above, impossibly fast. The walls vibrated with movement. The air turned thick with the stench of rot. Mark turned, his breath shallow. "We have to go up there?" Julia's head snapped toward him. "Are you insane?" But the whispering had changed. It wasn't asking to be let in anymore. It was calling them by name. "Julia, Mark, Lily." A cold gust rushed through the hallway as the attic door creaked open on its own, revealing a staircase swallowed in shadow. Mark swallowed hard. He turned to Julia and Lily. "Stay here." And then, gripping a flashlight with trembling hands, he stepped into the dark. Here's a much longer continuation of the enigma of the silent twins, filled with more horror, mystery, and blood-chilling terror. The old wooden steps groaned under Mark's weight as he ascended toward the open attic door, the beam of his flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. The air was thick, heavy with dust, and something else, a sour, rotting stench that clung to the back of his throat. Julia stood at the bottom of the stairs, clutching Lily tightly. "Mark, don't," she pleaded. But he had to. Something was in this house, something lurking in the shadows, and it knew their names. As he reached the top of the staircase, his breath hitched. The attic was nothing like he expected. It was vast, too vast. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, vanishing into blackness. The walls were lined with mirrors, hundreds of them, some cracked, some shattered, others covered in an oily residue that distorted reflections. Then he saw them. Two figures stood at the far end of the attic, backs turned to him. The twins, pale, thin, motionless. Mark's throat went dry. The air felt wrong, as if it had been stolen from the room. He lifted the flashlight, and as the beam touched the boys, their heads jerked toward him in perfect synchronization. But their faces, God, their faces. No eyes, just black, gaping pits, and their mouths, stitched shut with thick, dark thread, stretched painfully across their skin. Then, with slow, unnatural movements, they turned fully toward him. Mark stumbled back. His pulse thundered in his ears. The twins shouldn't exist. They had vanished decades ago. And yet here they were. One of them lifted a pale hand, bony, almost skeletal, and pointed directly at him. A whisper filled the attic. "You brought her back." Mark's breath caught. "Brought who back?" Then the mirrors shattered all at once. A deafening scream exploded through the attic as jagged shards rained down like knives, slashing at his arms and face. And then everything went dark. Julia flinched as the attic door slammed shut on its own, cutting off Mark's screams. "Mark!" she shrieked, racing toward the stairs. She tried to pry the door open, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something or someone was holding it shut from the other side. Behind her, Lily started whispering again. Julia turned, her stomach knotting. The child was standing in the middle of the hallway, head tilted slightly to the side. Her eyes, wide, unblinking, stared at something Julia couldn't see. "Lily, honey, what are you saying?" Lily slowly raised a hand and pointed at the wall. "They're inside now." A chill crawled up Julia's spine. She followed Lily's gaze and saw it. A bulge in the wallpaper. At first, it was small, like a bubble beneath the old floral print. But then it moved. Something inside the wall shifted, pressing outward, pushing against the paper like a hand reaching through skin. And then a face emerged. Julia screamed, stumbling backward as the shape of a mouth stretched open within the wallpaper. It didn't have eyes, only an impossibly wide, yawning void where a face should be. And then it spoke, not with words, with voices. Dozens of voices, layered over one another, whispering in different tones, in different centuries. "You can't hide her. She's ours. She belongs to us. She called us back." Julia grabbed Lily, her body trembling. "Who? Who belongs to you?" The whispering stopped. Then one voice, clearer, older, more twisted than the rest, answered. "The other one." Julia's blood went cold. "The other one?" The walls groaned. The bulging shape slithered beneath the wallpaper, moving toward the ceiling, toward the attic, toward Mark. Then a loud, bone-snapping crack echoed above them. And then silence. Something had just happened to Mark. Julia didn't remember how she got upstairs. The next thing she knew, she was standing in the attic doorway, breath coming in short gasps. The mirrors were gone. The attic was empty, except for Mark. He was on his knees in the middle of the room, body trembling, his arms limp at his sides. His flashlight lay flickering next to him, its weak beam barely illuminating his face. But his eyes were wrong. Dark, hollow, black. "Mark?" He lifted his head, staring past her, his lips parting as if to speak. But a whisper slipped out of his mouth. Not his whisper. It was the twins' voices. "They remember now." Julia staggered back. "Who remembers?" "Mark, what's happening?" Mark's head twitched to the side in a violent, inhuman motion. His lips curled into a grotesque smile. And then he stood up, not naturally, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. The attic door slammed behind her. Lily screamed downstairs. And Mark, or whatever was wearing Mark's body, now took a step toward her. His voice, cold, layered, hollow, wasn't his anymore. "You brought her back." Julia's heart pounded. "Brought who back?" Mark's head twitched again, that horrible grin widening. Then, from the darkness behind him, a third figure stepped forward. Not Mark, not the twins, someone else. And Julia suddenly understood. The Whitaker twins were never just two. There had been a third child, one that had been forgotten, one that had been erased from history. And now she wanted to come home. Julia could barely breathe. The attic seemed to stretch around her, warping and twisting like a living thing. The air was thick with the scent of mold and rot, and the darkness behind Mark shifted. The third figure emerged slowly. A girl, pale, ragged, hair matted with filth. Her eyes, black, bottomless voids, stared into Julia's soul. Mark, or whatever was inside him, stepped aside, bowing his head as if in deference to her. Julia's pulse thundered in her ears. This girl, she had never been part of the story. The town only spoke of the Whitaker twins. But she was here, and she had been waiting. Then, in a whispering, layered voice, the girl spoke. "You forgot me?" The attic shuddered. The walls pulsed. The temperature plummeted. Julia stumbled backward, heart hammering. "Who are you?" The girl took a step forward. Mark's lips moved, but the voice that escaped wasn't his. "Clara." The name sent a shock through Julia's chest. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong to this world. Clara's mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "You tried to erase me," she whispered. "But I remember. I remember everything." The attic groaned, and the floor tilted beneath Julia's feet. The mirrors, those shattered before, began piecing themselves back together. One by one, the shards rose from the floor, levitating into place as if time itself was being undone. The glass reflected something that wasn't there. Not the attic Julia saw, but another room, another time. Then, a new scene appeared in the mirror. A dimly lit bedroom. The walls covered in peeling, yellowed wallpaper. A wooden crib sat in the center, and inside it, a baby, crying. Julia gasped. She wasn't just looking at a reflection. She was looking into the past. And then, a woman stepped into the frame. Her face was gaunt, sickly, her eyes hollow. She moved with slow, jerky movements, her hands trembling as she reached into the crib. And then, she pressed a pillow over the baby's face. Julia screamed. The vision shattered. The attic lurched violently as the mirrors exploded outward, sending shards flying in all directions. Julia barely managed to shield her face. When she looked again, Clara was smiling. "She tried to erase me," the girl whispered. "But I never left." Mark's body twitched violently before dropping to the floor like a corpse. The attic door flew open. A wave of frigid air swept through the house, carrying a voice with it. A woman's voice. "Clara is gone. Clara is gone. Clara is gone." But Clara wasn't gone. She was right here, and she was angry. Julia scrambled down the attic stairs, heart slamming against her ribs. She nearly tripped over herself as she reached the hallway, slamming the door behind her. Lily was still standing in the middle of the hall. Her eyes were different now, distant, glazed over, as if she was listening to something Julia couldn't hear. "Lily, we have to go." The child blinked slowly, and then she whispered, "Clara's awake now." A chill crawled through Julia's spine. Before she could respond, the house shuddered. The walls groaned, stretched, pulsed, and then doors began slamming on their own. One by one, bang, bang, bang. The furniture shifted. The floorboards buckled. The house was alive. A sharp, piercing wail erupted from the walls, a child's scream. Julia grabbed Lily's wrist. "Come on." But the second she tried to run, the hallway stretched. The front door, just seconds away, was now impossibly far. The corridor seemed to lengthen, twisting into an endless void. The light bulbs overhead popped one by one, plunging them into flickering darkness. And then footsteps, soft, slow, approaching from behind. Julia turned. Clara was standing at the end of the hall. Her head twitched violently to the side, her mouth stretching open into an impossibly wide grin. "You can't leave," she whispered. The surrounding shadows shifted, and then the twins stepped forward, not just Elias and Edwin, but dozens of others, figures with hollow eyes and stitched mouths, all standing just behind Clara. They had been waiting, and now they were awake. The house collapsed inward. Julia barely had time to react before the walls caved in, swallowing her in darkness. For a moment, nothing. Then light, not from the house, from candles. Julia's head throbbed. The air was thick with the scent of wax and burning herbs. She wasn't in the hallway anymore. She was in a room, an old, forgotten room. The walls were lined with symbols drawn in blood. In the center of the room was a crib. Julia's breath caught in her throat. It was the same crib from the vision. She stepped closer. Inside, bones. Tiny, infant-sized bones. A soft giggle echoed through the room. Julia whipped around. Clara stood in the corner, smiling. "You found me," she whispered. Julia's throat was dry. "What happened to you?" Clara tilted her head. Her empty black eyes gleamed. She didn't want 3, the girl said. Only two. Two perfect boys. But I was the first. I was supposed to be the only one. The words sent a jolt of horror through Julia's chest. Clara's mother had killed her and buried her beneath the house. The walls groaned. The shadows shifted. Clara's grin widened. But I never left, she whispered. The house shook violently as the darkness swallowed Julia whole. The last thing she heard was Lily's scream. Julia woke up somewhere else. The room was wrong. The walls stretched too high, the ceiling seemed to pulse, and the floor was soft, like flesh beneath her hands. The candlelight flickered, casting twisted shadows that moved on their own. And in front of her, the crib, the same one she had seen in the vision, the one with the bones. Her stomach turned as she realized the bones were gone. The crib was no longer empty. A small, frail figure sat inside it. Clara. But now, she looked younger, her limbs impossibly thin, her skin deathly pale. She lifted her head, those black, empty eyes locking onto Julia. You took too long, Clara whispered. Julia tried to move, but her body felt heavy. From the shadows, something else stirred. The twins stepped forward, followed by dozens of others. They were everywhere now. Children with hollow eyes, mouths stitched shut, standing in rows, watching in silence. And Clara was smiling. I remember now, she whispered. I remember what she did to me. The air grew thick. The walls groaned. And then a new voice. Not Clara's. Not the twins. A woman's voice. You weren't supposed to come back. Julia turned. Standing in the doorway was a figure draped in shadows. A woman with sunken, lifeless eyes. The mother. The one who had murdered Clara. Clara's smile widened. You can't stop me anymore, the child whispered. The walls shuddered. And then, the past came alive. Julia saw everything. A storm raged outside. The mother, wild-eyed and desperate, held the crying infant in her arms. She wasn't rocking her. She was pressing a pillow over her face. The baby screamed, kicked, fought. But the mother only pressed harder. Until silence. Then, she carried the tiny, lifeless body to the attic, dug a hole beneath the floorboards, and buried her own daughter alive. Julia gasped, snapping back to reality. The mother was standing in front of her now, her face twisted with terror. Clara floated above the crib, her body contorting unnaturally. You stole my life, the girl whispered. The walls cracked open. The other children, the forgotten ones, screamed in unison. And the house began to devour itself. The mother collapsed, her skin rotting before Julia's eyes. Her mouth opened in a soundless scream as her body crumbled into dust. Clara turned toward Julia. The little girl, the vengeful ghost who had haunted this house for decades, was finally free. And then she smiled. The attic door burst open. Julia grabbed Lily, yanking her into her arms as the house collapsed around them. She ran. Through the twisting hallways, through the endless shadows, past the flickering candlelight. And then, she was outside. The second she crossed the threshold, the house began to cave inward. The roof buckled, the walls shattered, and then, in one final, thunderous roar, the house was gone. Nothing but a pile of rubble remained, and the spirits within it were finally silent.